Okay, so I'm delighted to be joined here today by Andy Beckett, who's the author of this splendid new book, When the Lights Go Out, A History of the 70s. Now I'm very keen to talk to Andy about the 70s because I see that as a time when it's a crucial decade in the history of liberty. And the question I'd like to start off by asking you is, what I find interesting about the 70s is this sort of extreme individualism of the 60s meets the economic individualism, which is coincided. And that happens at a time when the left's beginning to lose some of its traditions, and that there's the end of this consensus, and that politics is becoming more extreme.
That's right, that's right. I mean, I think the 70s is a time, as you say, when the sort of libertarianism of the 60s really reaches perhaps its sort of apex, the lifestyle things that people are doing to do with, you know, what they can watch on TV or what drugs they can take, which are preserves of really kind of elites in big cities in the 60s. In the 70s, that's a much more mainstream thing. So that kind of liberty, if you like, is expanding, and at the same time on the right, particularly once Thatcher becomes Conservative leader in 1975, there's a kind of growing interest in the liberty of the individual, particularly against trade unions, against government regulation, against taxation. So those two forms of liberty are arguably expanding, but, and I think it's quite a big but, I don't think the kind of new right were necessarily that interested in the liberty of the individual in other areas. And Samuel Britton, who was one of the journalists who propagated Thatcherism very effectively in the 70s when I interviewed him for my book, didn't actually vote for Thatcher in 79 because he thought she would be too draconian on civil liberties. Right. He's a true libertarian, and I found that fascinating.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's interesting that that civil liberty debate is touched on a lot in the 70s, and I'm thinking of something that I write about, which is the pub bombings in 1974, and the reaction to that Roy Jenkins brings in a Prevention of Terrorism bill. I wondered if you could talk about that, and that sort of tradition of civil liberties becomes sort of broken down in the face of public disorder, terrorism, things like that.
I think that's certainly quite a key moment. I think you're right to write about that, because Roy Jenkins was seen as a very liberal Home Secretary, obviously had been responsible for a lot of liberal reforms in the 60s and in the early 70s. And the fact that he said that this kind of emergency involving terrorism is severe enough for me to bring in a law, which I think he's himself described as draconian, is a kind of big moment. On the other hand, I would say that if you look at the provisions of that act compared to the terrorism legislation that's around now, although they're not admirable, they're actually quite limited compared to you know, how long police can hold suspects for now and so on. So although the act in 1974 was a big moment, arguably, you know, things were going to get a lot more authoritarian after that. But I think that perhaps Roy Jenkins, you could say, was panicked a little by what was going on. The legislation was brought in, I think, very quickly after the pub bombings in Birmingham, quite hastily, I think. But also I think the fact that a lot of people on the right, as I said, were not necessarily that interested in civil liberties in some spheres, meant that legislation like that could get through.
Yes, from what I remember, the Tories were asking for more, and Jenkins kept having to say, no, which served his purposes quite well.
Exactly.
And it's interesting that he comes from that kind of libertarian background. His father had been arrested in the miners' strike in 1926 under emergency legislation, and there's very few Home Secretaries that brought in emergency legislation as much as Jenkins did.
No, that's right. I mean, and even after 74, there were times when he acted really to sort of, as he sort of expand liberty. I mean, I write about this in my book, but there was a series of huge illegal pop festivals in the early 70s, and Jenkins actually ended up collaborating with the people setting up the pop festivals, and the Home Office actually helped sponsor an enormous one in 1975, kind of against really what the police wanted, because Jenkins believed that it was actually quite good for young people to go into the countryside and kind of do what they wanted for 3 or 4 days and break the law in small ways. It was a kind of growing experience. So even after 74, there are still moments when Jenkins was sticking his neck out, if you like, for the liberty of the individual.
And do you think that that's kind of the end of that kind of liberalism in British politics, before, I guess, the new right, with their kind of empowering of the individual in sort of economic fields, but becoming more draconian, to use Jenkins's phrase, in terms of public order and things like that? Do you think do you see this as the end of a kind of tradition that sort of?
I think that there are sort of strands of it which carry on. There are certain libertarian MPs in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party who carry on into the 80s, but I think it does diminish. I mean, I think the fact that Jenkins actually ended up leaving the Labour Party, of course, that was a big thing. I think also the fact that the Conservatives, once they're in office, showed, a great deal of interest in the liberty of the individual economically, but Samuel Britton was right. They didn't show much interest in civil liberties, and in fact used the police, in a pretty paramilitary kind of way at key moments in the 80s. Yeah, I think some of that libertarian strand in British politics, which had been around in the 60s and 70s, probably did kind of go. And I'm not sure if it's ever. I mean, I'm sure you'll have a view, but I'm not sure if it ever has come back with quite the same force. I'm not sure there's been a Home Secretary like Jenkins since then.
No, they've all been sort of a type. Really.
Yeah.
I think he's the last of that. But to the further left than Jenkins, and the idea of sort of resistance and protest in English culture, British culture, I should say. It seems to be there's a continuity from things like the miners' strike, or even before then, of kind of memories on the left of popular resistance. Do you have a view on that, and how that sort of survives the sort of polarisation of politics in the 70s?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that the idea of politics is something that a lot of people are involved in, and that can involve these very intense moments of sort of protest, strikes, big confrontations. That certainly survives the 70s, and the 80s is also marked. I mean, particularly the miners' strike in 84, 85, but lots of other moments in the 80s where that culture of kind of mass political involvement very much is kind of carrying on. I think also liberty in the 70s particularly expands in the sense that people feel they have power in areas that weren't seen as political before, like the environment, like sexuality, and people are arguing for those things. And I think a lot of that politics in the 70s becomes arguably more powerful in the 80s and subsequently. And if you look at where David Cameron stands on sexuality or on the environment, arguably the roots of that are in this kind of upsurge in new politics in the 60s and the 70s. So I think that side of liberty, if you like, has not gone. The idea that politics is not just about economic concerns, it's about broader things, and that there are debates and different ways of being, sexually or to do with gender, to do with the environment. I think that expansion of liberty that happened in the 60s and 70s hasn't ended. And you see that in very mainstream politics today. So I wouldn't be 100% bleak about it.
Sure.